All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the October 25th workshop for MNIDC, also Malaysian Nationals 2021. My name is Ernest. I'll be part of the Core for Nationals that's happening in mid-November. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about just a topic that I think is near and dear to a lot of us, myself especially. It is pertaining to minorities. So just very briefly, in this very brief workshop, I'll be walking you through several characteristics of minorities in general, some things to keep in mind when you're discussing about minorities in debates, for instance, and also just some of the goals that generally minority groups seek to achieve in society and how we can go about solving or attaining those things for minority groups. And then at the end of this workshop, we can also potentially delve into a motion pertaining to minorities, and then we can just go from there and see what kinds of points we can build on that motion itself. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen now. Yep. Okay, so can I get a confirmation that you guys can see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Very well. Right. So if you guys have any questions whatsoever, feel free to just let me know in text or via voice, whatever is fine. I will take any questions at any point in the workshop. So feel free to just ask any questions. Also, I'm afraid that like my Wi-Fi is a bit bad. So I think just to ensure that I don't lag or something like that, I will keep my camera off while I'm presenting. So you can just look at the slides and all that stuff, right? So all right. Minorities in a real world debate context. Right, so here are the 4 topics that I'm gonna cover today. Firstly, just talking in general about what minorities are, defining them, very basic definitions and characterizations, then going a bit deeper into characterizing minority groups, some of the things that make them stand out, and some of the things that you may not have noticed when it comes to minority groups, and how that actually is really important when you are forwarding arguments pertaining to minority groups and social movements in general. And then we can talk about some goals of minority groups in general, what they seek to achieve in society, just general things, and finally how we achieve them. But in the process of achieving them, what are some of the potential issues that can arise, and are we able to resolve all of these potential problems for these separate ways of attaining rights and equality for minority groups? So yeah, these are the 4 subtopics that I'll talk about. If you have any questions, just let me know at any point via text, via voice, any method is fine, right? So let's get started. Talking about minorities, what exactly is a minority group? So definitionally, if you're talking about minorities, by virtue of them being a minority, that means that they definitely exist in fewer numbers as compared to the majority group. And we're talking about like it's not just like a 40-60 split. I think more accurately so is when you're talking about minority groups within society, we're talking about a very stark difference in numbers. We're talking about something along the lines of like 20-80% or even 10-90%, for instance. So that's the definition of like minority on surface. But I think because minority groups exist within society alongside majority groups, this number, therefore, I think extends to a lot of other things, things like power, hierarchy, your capacity, your resources, all of these things, because you exist as a minority group as compared to the overwhelming majority. That means that you're also oftentimes at a relative disadvantage in comparison to your majority counterparts, specifically on the issue of whether or not you have the power to overcome things like structural barriers, whether or not you have the ability to yield as effective of a political lobbying as your majority counterparts. Those are the things that are tried and tested within society and have proven over and over again that minority groups also exist in a relative disadvantage as compared to the majority groups. Minority groups can be defined along different lines of classifications and characteristics. You have your racial minorities. So racial and ethnic minorities, for instance, in Malaysia, you will have obviously your Karasan Dusun people, your Iban people in Sabah Sarawak, a lot of the ethnic minorities that oftentimes go unheard of and unseen within society because we're just so accustomed to painting Malaysia as consisting of Malays, Chinese, and Indians, and then all of the rest just go relatively unnoticed. We have sexual minorities and gender minorities, for instance, the LGBTQ community, and even within the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of different lines of classifications. You have the gay people, you have the trans people, people who are non-binary, and allies, for instance. So there are many ways of classifying people, and all of these different lines of classifications will definitely result in some people being minorities as a result. So before we move on, I think it's also important. It's an important note to newer debaters and younger debaters to just pay attention to your language use whenever you're talking about minorities. It is very easy for us to use very broad strokes of characterizations to discuss a certain group of minorities. For instance, when you're talking about, say, African Americans in the United States, it is very easy for newer debaters to say things like, oh, they're prone to doing crimes, they are bad people, for instance, they get jailed the most. So you may not mean anything evil, you don't have malintent in making those statements, but I think those are sort of uncharitable to the groups, because the reason why African Americans are they are convicted so much more than white Americans, for instance, is because of barriers within the American society, things like structural barriers, how African Americans are more impoverished. They don't have the necessary resources, for instance, to fend themselves within the legal system. They're segregated. They're separated from the urban areas, the town areas where people access the most amount of jobs, and also just social barriers of how the police forces just tend to commit persecution against the minorities, these African Americans, for instance. So there are a lot of different factors that come into play when it comes to why a certain group of individuals are deemed to be, a certain way. There are a lot of factors that are involved. So my key and my imploration to everyone, if you're starting out, is to always just pay attention to your language use. Use equity abiding language, use appropriate language, don't use broad strokes of characterizations, be nuanced when it comes to characterizing why is it that certain groups of individuals are a certain way, and just be compassionate and be considerate when you're discussing minorities in general. This is a general rule of thumb that I think everyone should follow when it comes to discussing minorities. It will help a lot in making you sound a bit more charitable and more as having more empathy for these people, which would potentially help you in a debate round if it comes to that. Right. So that's just a very basic and surface level description and definition for minorities. Let's go on to the next one, which is characterizing minority groups. Minority groups in general, there are several, I would say, defining characteristics of minority groups that I think debaters in general can sort of leverage upon when it comes to setting up debates, for instance, and incorporating these characteristics within your analysis and talking about minority groups, the kinds of power imbalances, what do they prioritize within different minority groups, what are the kinds of fights that they want to fight for. So I think all of these characterizations are potentially useful for you when you're entering into a debate round and it's a minority motion. You can use all of these characterizations and just bear all of these in mind when you're making statements and sort of try and conjure arguments from these characterizations. The first characterization I have is obviously macro scale barriers. So as I said just now, minorities are they're not just definitionally a minority in terms of paling in terms of numbers. They pale also when it comes to their power and their capacity in comparison to the majority group. And these, like, they pale in comparison because of a lot of barriers that happen within society, a lot of structural barriers and social barriers. All of these things coexist within each other, I would say, to constitute a pretty insurmountable barrier for minorities alone to be able to counter against those barriers and to be able to topple and dismantle those kinds of negative perceptions that minority groups still suffer from today. So what are some of these structural barriers that I'm talking about? So structural barriers means barriers that are in place within the constitutions, for instance, or just how society operates in general, the way in which society decides to function and how people go about distributing opportunities to people on the ground, how we go about ensuring that society functions in a way that is like as smooth as possible. All of these things will lead to some form of structural barriers that ultimately means that minority groups are hampered as a result. So some of the examples that are prominent would be like quota systems within Malaysia, for instance. So like if you're considering the Chinese and the Indians as a minority group in comparison to the Malay majority, for instance, and you have quota systems like the Bumi Putra rights in place for the Malays in Malaysia, for instance, where I think, like, if I'm not mistaken, it's 90% of individuals who get admitted to matriculation college in Malaysia, and 90% of Malays get admitted, and then the rest of the 10% are distributed for the rest of the people who are non-Malays, for instance. So that quota system obviously works against the minorities in this instance, and that is a structural barrier because it's in place within the educational policy and constitution already, meaning that this constitutes a barrier that is very hard for the minorities, which are the Chinese and the Indians in this instance, to be able to overcome. Because you also have things like geographical segregations, unequal access to opportunities, be it education, employment, and I think the very obvious example when it comes to segregation is the African Americans, for instance. It's very easy for us to picture African Americans, being depicted in popular media these days as occupying slums or substandard housing within suburban areas, for instance, and that is largely because the way in which the American society operates is that privilege has entrenched generationally, and all of these like things like poverty and structural barriers have made it they have manifested generationally, so that African Americans just face so much barriers when it comes to accessing things like basic education, furthering education within a tertiary level in university, for instance, or the ability to access employment, for instance, because they're just so geographically segregated from everything. And then the places where they concentrate on, the places where African Americans populate the most, like for instance, New Orleans, for instance, those places just historically have less opportunities in place for people to be able to pursue a life that would provide them, some decent form of living, for instance. So all of these things are instances of, like, structural barriers that hinder the ability of a particular minority to be able to succeed within society. So I think there are many sort of instances that you can draw upon from your respective countries, for instance, respective societies. Just bear in mind that structural barriers are things that are already in place within how society operates. And then adding on to structural barriers would be like social barriers, for instance. So when I say social barriers, I mean things like, societal perceptions against these minority groups, some preconceived notions of these people being bad people, for instance, and all of these things, because society is operated by humans, by people, by individuals within society. The manifestation of your negative perception will spill over to all of these structures within society. That means that these minority groups will have less of an ability to attain equality or opportunities as compared to the majority counterparts that are, deemed to be more palatable, for instance, right? So some social barriers would be things like discrimination at the workplace, during interviews, being subjected to more invasive, unnecessarily invasive and inappropriate questions during interviews, more harsh tactics. Also, just in general, minority groups are more prone to, uh, being victims of derogatory language, people using slurs and just very bad language against these minority groups. And also just even if you don't use these language, just the general perception that, for instance, African Americans are destined to be poor, for instance, or the perception that they're always going to be violent or they're a threat to society, for instance. All of these things are just negative perceptions that are instances of social barriers that minority groups all as a collective they still face to this very day. So yeah, macro scale barriers, I think it's very intuitive, just the kinds of things that hinder the ability for minority groups to be able to succeed within society on a larger scale. Yeah, so I think this is very intuitive. Yeah, the next one, as I take a sip of water. Heterogeneity. So what I mean by this is that minority groups are also very heterogeneous. It is very easy sometimes for us to like lump minorities as one large subset of individuals, just one large minority group. It's like a black and white thing, right? But it's important to recognize that there are different minority groups based on different lines of characteristics and classifications. So that's like the bigger classification, as in you have different minorities based off of different lines of division, for instance. So like racial minorities in Malaysia, you have like it's not just the Yang line, like the others that are not listed out in your in registration forms. For instance, you have your Kadasan Sun, the Kadasan Dusun people, the Iban people, all of the ethnic minorities that oftentimes don't go as noticed as compared to the three main ethnic groups within Malaysia, for instance. In the US, you have your African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, even people who have emigrated to the US from, say, the Middle East, for instance, right? So there are a lot of different minority groups, gender minorities, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, for instance. So just understand that you cannot lump every single minority individual as one huge minority group. There are a lot of subsets within. So especially since, like, if you look at the LGBTQ movement, for instance, obviously L stands for lesbian and then G for gay, B for bi, and then T for trans. Even that alone is like 4 different subsets of people. And then once you add in like the Q and plus, which stands for a lot of other different things like queer and asexual, for instance, non-binary. There are a lot of different subsets of individuals within that minority group, right? So sure, we all want the same thing, which is things like better forms of integration, equality, but that's like just an overarching fight, right? There are different levels of prioritization within their fight for different kinds of rights, right? So for instance, for gay people, it would be like fighting for things like gay marriage, for instance, prioritizing things like the ability to express themselves within gay pride, for instance. But for trans people, it's something a bit more dire because they're traditionally less noticeable, or they're often deprioritized. So they don't even have basic protection like the ability to go to bathrooms that are reflective of their gender, for instance. Just anti-hate laws, protection against things like violence, for instance, from bigoted groups of people. There are different levels of prioritization for different groups of minorities within a large minority group. So just recognize that different minority groups exist. There are different subsets of individuals within that minority group itself. And also there are varying levels of privilege and wealth within the minority group. Obviously, say for instance, if you're talking about the African Americans, for instance, not everyone is going to be living in like the slums of New Orleans, for instance. You will obviously have people like Oprah Winfrey, for instance, who are very, very well off, or people who are just doing relatively better than the other individuals who are struggling with their existing circumstances within the substandard housings that they currently occupy. So, and like privilege also extends to like the LGBTQ community. You know, it's oftentimes the gay individuals, the gay white male that get the most traction in comparison to the other trans people, for instance. So yeah, there are different levels of prioritization, different levels of privilege and wealth that exist within that minority group. So do not homogenize different groups of people. Be nuanced when it comes to characterizing these people. The third one is in-group power dynamics. And there are two, obviously, positive and negative. So the first thing is positive. And I think this is something that you can leverage on within debate rounds, just the understanding that because these people exist as a minority and they have gone through similar struggles of being a minority, things like facing barriers that are hard to be overcome, things like just the inability to be able to lead a life where they feel like they belong within society, means that they have experienced similar struggles. And it's because they have experienced similar struggles that means that there's more likely for them to want to put in place communal structures in order to sort of assert this notion of solidarity, of togetherness amongst these people who are your brothers and sisters. And it's a positive thing because essentially these minority individuals collectively recognize that they need to stick together as a united front, especially since they, as a minority group, have had to endure a lot of horrible things from the majority counterparts, right? So some examples of this is obviously your African Americans. Like hip hop is something that's very big in America. The way in which people or Black artists utilize hip hop as a genre to express solidarity is something that's really, really huge. Like just using music as a platform to sort of show themselves and push forth their identity and make them feel like, you know, they are hurt in a way. All of these things are things that constitute a positive dynamics within that in group, within that minority group. You also have like the Latinos, for instance. I think if you guys like, you know, do a bit of research, you will know that the Latin Americans in America, they are very big on family. They're very big on, you know, having that big family together, that community sticking together and supporting each other. That's why you have places like Chinatown in America where they stick up for each other. Obviously, that's Asians, but also you have like Latin Americans. You have the Spanish community, the Mexican Americans that like they stay in close proximity with one another, and they constantly organize, you know, gatherings and stuff like that. Huge, you know, gatherings to be able to sort of ensure that they have that sense of solidarity that makes sure that everyone feels as if they're supported by the people within that group. And also just like the LGBTQ movement, for instance, things like gay pride, just being able to march on the streets and be unapologetic with showing who you are as an individual, as a gay person, as an LGBTQ identifier, for instance. So all of these things necessarily mean that the minority groups, by virtue of them recognizing that they have to exist together, means that there's better incentive for them to exist stronger as a collective, to get more traction, to in order to fight for things like better rights, equality. And even if they don't get better rights and equality, at the very least, you get some sense of comfort, some sense of support for your brothers and sisters, and you at the very least feel like, okay, this perhaps like the majority hates me, but it's still a bit more bearable because I have at the very least my brothers and sisters alongside me who make me feel like I belong and make my existence feel validated in that front. So yeah, that is just the positive power dynamics that exist within the minority groups. With the positive comes the negative. So minority groups, as much as we want to think that they're united, they're not always united. Splintering happens, And this is largely because of, like I said just now, there are different subsets of individuals that exist within minority groups. They have different levels of prioritization, different goals that they wish to fight for within society, for instance. It's not always that they have a similar goal or a similar battle that they seek to achieve. And it is because of that that splintering sometimes happens. You have just like gay people fighting for marriage equality, and then you have the trans people just being on their own and fighting for things like basic protection against hate crimes, for instance. So that's where the splintering happens. The negative thing with like this kind of unequal relationship within the minority group is that oftentimes the most prominent minority individuals, they become the forefront of the movement at the expense of the other people. So I think a very good example of this is like the LGBTQ community. If you look at how the movement has been forwarded, historically speaking, like a few decades ago, it's always like gay, white, cis male at the front of the movement, or at the very least, just gay individuals fighting for things like marriage equality, or fighting for things like the ability to have a civil union, for instance. And that's why, because of the historical fight of the people before us, we've been able to have marriage equality in America, for instance. But that comes at the expense of like, the trans people that we also have to protect, because presumably people think that trans people are like it's a bit of a culture shock for people. They don't think that it's something that they are comfortable with, the notion of. And it is because of that that they're often deprioritized by the movement, because the movement wants to appear more palatable, for instance. So it is because of that that you still see a lot of trans people today, wherever, trans people just getting deprioritized, them being subjugated to a subordinate position where they oftentimes bear the most brunt when it comes to things like gender-based violence, hate crimes, slurs, derogation against these people. So based on the illustration that I've given you, it is very clear that there is a very huge power imbalance between like the gay white individuals and like the trans people, because of the different fights and the different kinds of privilege that they have within that minority group. This means that splintering happens, and therefore the movement isn't exactly as united as we want to perceive it to be. Another example is like feminism. If you consider women a relative gender minority in most Asian countries, I would say. So you have like women in urban areas and women in rural regions. They have different fights as well. Women in urban areas presumably are working class women, and they would push for things like, parity in like pay, equal pay, for instance, and maternity leaves, for instance. Whereas women in rural regions, the women who don't have access to these kinds of employment, they oftentimes just prioritize more urgent things like the ability to have basic forms of protection against domestic abuse, for instance. So there's different kinds of fight that exists between these different subgroups of people within society, and therefore it is just important for us to bear in mind that, like I said, these minority groups are not homogenous. They exist with different levels of prioritization. And it is because of this that minority groups themselves, they oftentimes don't appear as united, and how therefore that leads to a lot of different nuances that we have to cater to when it comes to how we forward the fight for equality. Do we prioritize a collective as a whole, or do we also prioritize just a certain subset of individuals and letting them have the identity to push forward their movement in a more comprehensive manner that doesn't come at the expense of their message getting diluted by supposedly a more privileged minority within that subgroup, right? So these are the three main characterizations I have for minority groups. So macro scale barriers, heterogeneity, and the in-group power dynamics, be it positive or negative, right? So yeah, these are the characterizations. Let's move on to the goals of minority groups. There are a few goals that you can also talk about when it comes to minority groups in a debate. Obviously, depending on the kind of motion that you get, the goals would have to vary. But if you're able to leverage upon these goals when it comes to prepping your cases, for instance, and just zone in on the goals of minority groups and how you're better able to achieve those goals, then I think you're pretty much set for a minority group motion and defending the right for minority groups. The first goal obviously is to get more opportunities for these minority groups, especially in terms of attaining success at the workplace and education, getting wealth, for instance, ensuring that you liberate minority groups from their existing undesirable circumstances. So obviously, when it comes to things like this, things like opportunities for accessing jobs at the workplace, accessing wealth, for instance, you would need things like affirmative action, which basically means just equal opportunities for everyone and ensuring that there's an equal level playing field across different minority groups or different races within society. Also, just the general ability for minority individuals to be able to access areas that were previously inaccessible, things like employment, education, for instance, getting more people to be able to opt into better employment and better education to better themselves, as opposed to being stuck within their existing circumstances and be continuously seen as not likely to succeed by the majority counterparts, right? So, like I said, for instance, having more African Americans accessing corporate jobs, for instance, it's not because they don't have the skills to do so. It's because firstly, they don't have the qualifications because presumably university tuition fees are very expensive and they don't have the ability to access scholarships, for instance. Therefore, that means that they're always at a back foot because they're always lacking in qualifications and their education in order to access corporate jobs, for instance. So all of these things necessarily mean that we have to give affirmative action and ensure that these people are able to have that opportunity to attain that success. And also things like just women as a gender minority accessing STEM fields because they're always seen as the domicile gender and the gender that is supposedly supposed to just stay at home and raise a family and stuff like that, when there should be an ability and the choice for women to be able to access STEM field jobs and the ability to have parity at the workplace and the ability to access leadership positions, for instance, and not be relegated to a position that is subordinate to the men just because of patriarchy within society. So yeah, I think this goal is very intuitive, just having more opportunities for success and wealth. The second thing is just equal societal treatment. And I say this by talking about, right, like just pertaining to how societal rules are currently just unfairly implemented and how it's used to unfairly target certain groups of people based off of their immutable characteristics. So what I talk about, what I mean in this instance is that things like incarceration, for instance, how a African American or a Black person is more likely to be convicted and be sentenced to a harsher punishment or harsher sentence compared to a white counterpart for doing the exact same crime, for instance. So that pertains to just an unfair implementation of the incarceration policies, for instance. Also, just things like the need to eradicate police brutality against African Americans, for instance. I think it's very intuitive. The Black Lives Matter movement on the heels of Trayvon Martin and George Floyd being murdered unfairly at the hands of white policemen. So just the dire need for minorities to be able to have equal societal treatment and not be treated unfairly just based off of their skin color, for instance, or other lines of characteristics. Also, for instance, like in more conservative countries, for instance, like say like Russia, for instance, or Indonesia, as of late, you see how laws are being weaponized against the LGBTQ individuals within these respective countries to sort of pressure them into denouncing their way of life, for instance, and get them to be straight individuals when they obviously cannot, So all of these things are just instances of unequal societal treatment. And obviously, when you're talking about the ability for individuals to be able to to live in a society where they feel like they're part of a society, that obviously means that you need to do a lot more in terms of getting some form of equality when it comes to how they're treated within society. And I think that's also something that you can also talk about, just how we get people to treat people more fairly, be it through the legal system or social interactions, for instance, just ensuring that people are treated fairly and they're not unfairly targeted based off of their immutable characteristics on that front. So that's on equal societal treatment. The third thing, as I take a sip of water again, the third thing is on integration while maintaining your own identity. And I'll talk about this data in the how to achieve these things section, which comes after this. So integration obviously means the ability to coexist with the majority group in a productive manner. And I say productive because to coexist alone is just not sufficient. I think it's also important for minority individuals to feel like they are respected and that they are able to live within that society in a way where they feel productive and they feel accepted for who they are. They're not just merely tolerated, but they're just integrated wholly into that society as part of being a citizen of that nation, for instance. So that's integration, but I think it's also important to note that because these people experience, different cultures, for instance, they have different identities by virtue of being Latin American, for instance, or if you're Kadasan Dusun in Malaysia, you have sort of like that identity to yourself, that core part of your making and your identity that you wish to hold on to. So that is where you strike a balance between integration while also maintaining the sense of who you are, the sense of identity that the community has imparted onto you by virtue of you being part of that community, and just striking the balance between the two. It's a lot easier said than done because firstly, integration is really hard. It's really hard to dismantle a lot of the sort of existing preconceived notions that people have against minorities in general, because we think there's a tendency for people to think that minorities, by virtue of them being minorities, this means that they're abnormal or they don't conform to mainstream standards of what is deemed acceptable, for instance. So that integration alone is very, very hard. But even if you do get integration, the strike of balance between integration and identity is also really tricky. So if it's total integration and like assimilation entirely where you lose your identity, is that something that is permissible? Is that something that is acceptable towards these minority individuals, right? So for some, identity is also something that they really hold on to, like especially say for instance the African Americans, right? So in a world where they are totally integrated and they assimilate into the white corporate world, and they just cannot access things like hip hop, for instance, because it's frowned upon and stuff like that. That's also not very good on the mental psyche of that individual, that minority, because it does feel like you have to completely sacrifice your identity in order to be able to integrate within that society, to feel like you're accepted by the majority, which is like not a good thing, because you want to be able to still have your identity as an African American, as a Black individual, enjoying certain things, things like hip hop, things like Southern food, for instance. So all of these things are just incredible nuances that ought to be delved into in any debate, wherever possible. I think that definitely would make up for a more holistic debate, as opposed to just saying that, oh, people need to integrate, but you just leave it at that without talking about whether or not people can still maintain that sense of identity as a minority individual in the process of assimilating and integrating. So yeah, these are the sort of broad goals of minority groups. Obviously, the list is like not exhaustive. You can branch off of all of these different goals of minority groups, but these are the large chunks of goals that I think debate rounds tend to touch upon. So we can just ensure that you guys try to cover all of these bases, and I think you guys would be able to sort of have sort of a more comprehensive case when it comes to forwarding arguments. The last part of this workshop is just talking about, or rather the penultimate one. The penultimate part of this workshop is to talk about how we achieve these goals, the aforementioned goals by for minority groups within society. So there are a few ways that I've listed here. And what I've done is I've listed the broad method in which we get rights for minority people, but also just some of the problems that happen for each of these singular solutions, and why is it that that's bad, and is there an ability for us to counter against those kinds of potential issues that can happen in resulting to a certain method of attaining rights. So the first method is obviously to rely on social movements, because social movements are premised upon getting equality and just generally speaking, rights for individuals on the ground, and countering any sort of injustices and unfairness that happens to individuals within society. And because we're talking about minority groups who are oftentimes, unfortunately, victims of unfair circumstances and unfair treatment by society in general, this also means that social movements largely pertain to minority groups in general. So what you want to do in social movements is obviously to bandwagon with other people, forming a larger set of individuals, a larger movement, a larger group of people, a larger community, to ensure that you have sufficient critical mass and critical traction to be able to get more rights for minority groups, right? So obviously with a larger critical mass, you can do a lot more things like pulling more resources, for instance, to get more protection for the people that need the protection the most, for instance. You can also go protest on the streets, for instance, because obviously if you're going to be disrupting the operations of society, that means that there's an incentive for the majority to want to listen to you, so that you minimize disruptions as much as possible, so that you're able to get the kinds of rights for minority groups in general, basically just ensuring that you get as large of a group as possible to get the rights for the people and protection for your people within the minority group. I think this is intuitive, but the bigger question, therefore, is, are social movements actually doing enough for the minority individuals on the ground, right? If you consider the thing that I talked about previously when it comes to characterizing minority groups, I said that there are a lot of different subsets of individuals within a minority group, right? So like I said, for instance, the LGBTQ movement, you have the cis gay male forwarding the fight for marriage equality. You have trans brothers and sisters fighting for things like basic protection and having toilets reflective of their genders, for instance. So there's different fights, and because of that, what happens is there's an imbalance in the power dynamics between the different groups within society, which means that this leads to sort of a privilege arbitration that happens within movements, where certain subsets of individuals are favored at the expense of other subsets of individuals that are smaller and are deprioritized when it comes to forwarding a particular movement. So just to run off of the example that I gave, the reason why privilege arbitration exists within the LGBTQ community is because like gay marriage is something that is comparatively more palatable back in the day compared to things like trans people and cross-dressing and gender confirmation surgery, for instance. So all of these things necessarily mean that the LGBTQ movement made a conscious decision of prioritizing marriage equality and having gay male or gay female cis individuals forwarding or being the front of the movement in fighting for the LGBT community, as opposed to letting trans people have the say within the minority group as well. So that's where the privilege arbitration exists within movements, because not everyone is being catered to. there's a favoritism that exists for the set of individuals that are deemed to be more palatable by society, as compared to the supposedly more jarring ones in the eyes of society, right? So this deprioritization oftentimes happens in the process, and it's still very much visible today, right? If you look at like America, for instance, yeah, we've gotten marriage equality, gay people can get married, but we're still in a world where, you know, trans people are still getting murdered, trans people are still subjected to a lot of gender-based violence within America, for instance, and they just go unreported. They just don't get as much traction because, you know, people are just conditioned to think that, oh, marriage equality is what the movement fights for, and everything else is like second. It's of second priority. It's not as important anymore, right? So that is how the deprioritization happens within the process. Is this something that's okay? Obviously not, but the way in which you, I think the way in which you go about sort of and this is where, you know, an opposition can say that, oh, social movements are not doing enough, you know, they're always favoring a certain group of individuals within society. I think the way in which you can sort of resolve this is by saying that at the very least, because individuals exist as a large collective, this means that you know, people are catered to on the net, because everyone can have this blanket of being a part of the LGBTQ community as being this a large group of individuals that need protection. Everyone can fall back onto that large blanket, as opposed to if you don't have a large minority group, or if you don't have a large social movement, that means that the trans brothers and sisters would have to fight for their respective causes on their own without the help of, like, you know, the large movement, which is like obviously going to be a lot harder, because, you know, at the very least, in a world where you have large social movements, people are more likely to listen to you, as compared to you being a splintering of the actual movement, the actual LGBTQ movement, and fighting things on your own, which means that you get very likely less traction and less visibility as compared to everyone else, right? So this is where the back and forth happens, right? Is it okay for you to have a large social movement where people get deprioritized in the process, or is it okay for or do we favor a world where we get more trans people, for instance, at the forefront of the movement to fight for things like more visibility for trans people and more basic protections and stuff like that? So that's where the back and forth exists, right? So there's no right and wrong answer. It's just based off of how you're able to convince the judges as to whether or not this is the most strategic way in which social movements should go about forwarding you know, rights and protection for the people within that minority group itself, right? So just when you talk about social movements, obviously just consider that they're not doing enough, obviously, because there's arbitrations that exist within these movements, but also in a world where you don't have large-scale movements, what does that do to the ability for these different subsets of individuals to be able to fight for their respective causes? Is it better for individuals to fight on their own, or is it better for individuals to fight alongside the larger movement itself? I think that's something that that's the back and forth that can happen between Gov and Op in any minority motions. I think that's something that you guys can bear in mind. So that's social movements. Second thing is the implementation of policies that directly give equality and directly give opportunities to individuals on the ground. So obviously things like giving scholarships, for instance, letting people have the financial means and capacity to be able to access things like education, to attain a qualification, things like affirmative action, ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity to access whatever areas of their desired field, and things like mandatory quota systems, just ensuring that everyone, regardless of your race, ensuring that a particular field has a minimum amount of, say, minority groups within that workplace, to ensure that there's representation and there's more exposure for these minority groups within a workplace, for instance, and just better redistribution of opportunities in a more equitable manner, just implementing policies to ensure that minorities have a direct opportunity to step foot onto their respective fields of workplace or education, for instance, in order to stand a better chance of attaining success and wealth within society to achieve the parity with the majority counterparts. The potential issue with this solution or this method is the issue of tokenism. So, like I said previously, it is just really hard to sort of topple the manifestation of the sort of negative perceptions that people already have against minority individuals, right? So you could argue if you're not if you're arguing against this implementation of policy, things like quota system, scholarships, for instance, for minority individuals, you can argue that it's tokenistic because sure you get you get people to you get more people to opt into like these areas, but you're not changing the fundamental perceptions of people on the ground who belong to the majority group and how they perceive of minority individuals as being less capable of success. So all of these things necessarily still are factors that hinder the ability for individuals to be able to like minority individuals to be able to have a productive and a conducive working environment, the ability for them to be able to integrate within society in a productive manner, the ability for them to live and feel truly accepted as opposed to falling victim to the majority thinking that we've done enough for the minority people because we've given them scholarships, right? And that is also something that's potentially harmful because if you're already giving scholarships and affirmative action to minority individuals, that means that people can feel like they have done enough, which means that there's less of an incentive for majority individuals to want to sort of invest more efforts into truly helping out and putting forward continuous efforts to ensure that minority individuals are truly catered to in a sustainable manner and not just a one-off thing by giving them scholarships and giving them a quota, for instance. So that's the issue of tokenism, right? And I think the way in which the counter to tokenism is to just say that, tokenism is not as important. Like, sure, people may still have those preconceived notions, but at the very least, you're giving minorities an actual head start. You're giving them an actual opportunity to exist on a level playing field. You're letting more minority individuals on the net have a better opportunity to exist on a level playing field with the majority counterparts. So even if it's something that's tokenistic, at the very least, firstly, you get more visibility, you get more exposure, and even if it's not even if it doesn't result in like massive changes, at the very least, just the net amount of cash flow back towards the minority communities in general is something that will still benefit the minority communities as a whole. So tokenism is something that just isn't as important when we can provide more for the minority communities that desperately need the kind of money and the kind of protection in order for them to be able to exist in a more productive manner. So that's the counter against tokenism when it comes to implementing policies. Obviously, there's a very robust back and forth between gov and op when it comes to implementing policies, but that's the debate. That's mostly pertaining to how you're able to prove to the judges whether or not your side is the one that is actually able to help minorities when it comes to getting them the opportunity to succeed and exist in a workplace in a way that is conducive for them and is helpful for them, not just for themselves but also for their communities. When the trickling down effect and the cash flow trickles back down to the minority communities, right? So that's the implementation of policies. The third thing is just leveraging upon minority values, for instance. So and this pertains to identity, right? Like I said just now, when it comes to integration and identity, I would like to think that society in general has made, I think, great strides in recognizing things like diversity, for instance, recognizing the need for us to be more equitable for different groups of people within society, especially for minority individuals, be ethnic, religious, gender, sexual, racial. So it is because of this that the minorities can actually leverage upon this progression and this trend of progression to use your uniqueness and your identity to gain more visibility. So the way in which you go about doing this is perhaps things like commercialization, for instance, using parts of your identity, parts of your culture, commercializing it to ensure that you get more visibility, you get more exposure, you put your culture out there for the people to see so that people better understand the culture, the better understand the way in which your minority group operates, and you reduce cultural dissonance. Cultural dissonance meaning people don't understand your culture, people don't understand the way in which your culture operates, the kinds of things that, like for instance, like rituals of religious minorities, for instance, um, sort of slangs within the LGBTQ community, for instance. All of these things can be overcome in a world where you're able to utilize your identity as a leverage to get more people to want to opt into knowing about your culture as a whole. And there are several trends to show that this is likely to happen because people want to appear more charitable. They also want to know more about like different cultures because people have a innate need to discover about things that they don't know about inherently, right? So all of these things necessarily mean that there is a leverage that minority individuals and minority groups in general can utilize to sort of ensure that they get more exposure and they lobby for more sort of visibility and more exposure towards the majority group, and therefore achieve some form of integration and acceptance by the majority group while still having their identity. The potential issue, obviously, is if you're commercializing your culture, that possibly leads to some total assimilation at the expense of your identity. So always making sure that your culture is the most commercialized form of your culture. So you're always taking away bits and pieces of the nuances of the culture to make it appear more palatable to the masses. So you're losing bits by bits your identity, which is something that's like not good, for instance. And also there's the potential issue of like cultural appropriation when the majority sort of jump onto the bandwagon of commercializing your cultural values, for instance, and profiting off of your cultural uniqueness. All of these things are just like horrible things that work against minority individuals. So these are potential issues that obviously opposition can also bring forth, right? And how it's just not justified for us to commercialize culture, for instance, right? Some possibilities of countering against these things, right? I think I would perhaps say that call out culture is something that we can weaponize, like because social movements now are so strong and they're so like aggressive when it comes to calling out people who engage in cultural appropriation, or they don't give the necessary dues to the groups of individuals that they've profited off of. You can say that all of these things are necessarily incentives for people to not want to be as reckless when it comes to commercializing minority cultures, for instance. And just even if even if cultural appropriation happens and like total assimilation happens, at the very least, you're still putting your community out there, your minority community out to the public. You're getting the majority to view your minority community in a more mainstream light, and that is good for exposure. That's good for some form of contact theory. That's good for some form of contact, and based off contact theory, because you get more contact, that means that there's better chances for some form of assimilation and coexistence to happen, as compared to where you don't commercialize and people are just stuck within their echo chambers and they don't do anything to get the word out there and achieve some form of like integration and acceptance. So that's the back and forth when it comes to leveraging upon minority identity and values. It's again largely pertaining to how you're able to convince the judges as to whether or not you can mitigate something, or is identity the utmost important thing that people ought to prioritize at all times, and it's something that you truly cannot sacrifice. So this is the back and forth that like individuals can, like debaters can sort of feed off of and try and brainstorm during prep time and during debate rounds, just to ensure that you guys are able to cover your bases and ensure that you have enough analysis. Right, so that's it when it comes to achieving goals, the methods. Yeah, any questions before we move on to this sample motion? And me, I can give you guys a bit of pointers when it comes to this motion, for instance, and what we can discuss. Right, so we have a question. If you're on the site that says we should deprioritize X minority, for instance, opposing affirmative action, what are common arguments or responses and examples we can use to equitably go about it? If you're saying that we should actively we should be deprioritizing a certain minority, I think the way I would go about justifying that trade-off is to say that if we're going to be deprioritizing a certain minority, this necessarily means that that minority is not at the forefront of the movement, meaning that their goals and their causes are likely to be less palatable. So because of that, if they're going to do it, if they're going to fight for the cause as a singular unit separate from the movement, this means that they are more prone to larger attacks from the majority. They're more prone to derogatory statements and slurs from the majority group. And that is a world in which that X minority is it's definitely worse off because you have less protection. It's better off if you are able to bandwagon with that larger majority that you were previously in. So the example is like, trans people bandwagoning with the overarching LGBTQ community that's fronted by the gay people within society, and just utilizing that large community as a blanket, as a safety net against any sort of potential like targeted attacks and all of these things, because you exist as a large collective and a large unit, then there's an incentive for people to just want to ensure that the large collective is protected from everything else, from all of the derogatory statements that can possibly be accrued onto the trans individuals, right? So yes, the cause of the trans people will perhaps be deprioritized in that movement, but assuming in a world where they are already deprioritized anyway, it is unlikely where they're able to sort of attain any sort of meaningful changes and meaningful milestones in achieving rights. Therefore, what the trans people should prioritize is presumably things like more dire forms of protection that you can get by bandwagoning with like the larger majority, right? So even if it comes at the expense of like less visibility and less exposure, you're comparatively more shielded and more protected, which is a better thing for the trans people in general, right? So that's how I would go about sort of equitably deprioritizing a certain subset of minority. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, if you have any other questions, just feel free to if you are going to be opposing affirmative action entirely, and if you're going to be deprioritizing an entire group of minorities in general, I would say that because it's understandably very hard in a social movements motion to say that we should discard a minority group entirely. I think the closest I would say is that if you are part of a minority that is already disenfranchised within society, meaning whatever efforts that you put forth towards fighting for your right as a minority group is going to be clamped down upon, this necessarily means that you're unlikely, like I said, you're unlikely to achieve large strides in terms of getting significantly better changes. Therefore, what you ought to do is to just dial back and focus on what you can do internally as a minority group, as opposed to trying to continuously fight for things like affirmative action and things like scholarships, for instance, or better forms of equitable redistribution of opportunities, for instance, because presumably that leads to a lot of pushback from the majority. And once you get more pushback from the majority, the minority group suffers as a result. So you don't want the minority group to suffer. So you would rather trade off things like, tokenistic forms of affirmative action that leads to more pushback in favor of ensuring that you don't aggravate the pushback from the majority group, and ensure that the minority group is on a comparative safer and more protected in a world where they can have more communal structures. Say, for instance, the Latin Americans, they can always stick with each other and all that stuff and have more protection and more solace as a result, right? So that's how I would go about, that's the closest I would say I would go about deprioritizing a X minority and forwarding that argument in the most palatable manner. Right. Okay. So if you have any other questions as a result, just let me know in the chat later or voice. I will happily answer any questions. In the meantime, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and then we'll just move on to the sample motion, and we can discuss a bit on what arguments we can run. Okay, I think you guys can see my screen. So yeah, this house believes that privileged minority persons living in a conservative society should not emigrate to more liberal countries. Yeah, so obviously in the debate you have Gov, you have Op. I won't go too much into like the case setup and stuff like that, but I think some of the basic premises that you can establish from the very beginning is that because this is a conservative society that you're in, because you're in a conservative society, this presumably means that you have very minimal rights. Your integration is hard, lots of barriers working against you, and because you are a privileged minority, means that you have the resources to cushion yourself against all of the pushbacks that you talk that comes from the majority in a conservative society. And obviously, finally, a more liberal country is where you're presumably more accepted. Yeah. Okay. So on government bench, you're saying that privileged minority individuals should probably not emigrate to liberal countries, and they should stay and live within the conservative society. So I think the first thing that I would sort of run is principle, and this is where I talk about obligation. So presumably, as a privileged minority individual, you are privileged because you were able to sort of firstly either run a business, or you're able to run a business where the people within your community were able to sort of buy stuff from your business and opt into your service and help contribute to your privilege and contribute to your wealth. So I would just say that, your privilege is a direct result of your minority community actively helping you out to achieve the success you have today. Which therefore means that you cannot leave them behind, you owe them the obligation to be able to, you owe them the obligation to fight for their rights and protection. And you can also say that presumably you have the privilege, so meaning you have the money and maybe even like political capital to some extent. So you have the ability to, at the very least, lobby for some policies and protection no one else can, because you're the presumably you're part of the only people within that community that is able to like fight for the rights of your community, of your minority community, within that conservative society, right? So I would say that's a principal obligation. Because of that, you owe that responsibility towards your people. The second thing is perhaps outcomes. So why is this not? Sorry. Okay, it's not working. Anyway, yeah, outcomes. So I think one of the things I would do is I would just make a comparison between life in a foreign liberal country versus your own country with your minority community. So if you emigrate, you're starting over in a foreign land. You have no immediate families, communities to fall back on. Like, sure, people are accepting, people may be more accepting of you, but you're not able to exercise your identity to its fullest extent. Always having need to assimilate to the majority. Right? And that's detrimental towards your identity and your well-being, because you want to be able to practice who you are as part of that minority group of individuals, right? So if you don't emigrate, then sure, you get discrimination by being a minority, but at least you have the money and privilege to cushion against discriminations. I would also argue that because you are an influential person, presumably, influential person within your community, within your minority, this also means that perhaps people look up to you. People look up to you. You feel more sense of belonging, more affinity towards your community. stronger ties, stronger community, because you can actively help build that, build them up. You can also say that because you are in that country itself, you're closer enough to the community to fight for changes, such as lobbying, and you cannot do that if you migrate to a foreign nation. Right. So I think this is a very basic gov case for a motion like this. So these are reasons why you probably should not be emigrating to a more liberal country. If you're opposition, for instance, and you're arguing for, if you're arguing in favor of emigrating to a more liberal country, perhaps the principle is that you don't owe your community an obligation, and you can just say perhaps the wealth was intergenerationally accumulated because of structural reasons rather. Or you can also say that like prioritizing your own happiness will always supersede prioritizing the community's well-being, because people should not be social battering rams or changes, right? So you like as an individual, as a privileged minority person, you should be able to fend for yourself, because you're still very much subjected to discrimination, right? It's not like you're immune. Just because you have money doesn't mean that you're immune to all these discrimination and the kind of policies in place, right? So it is justified for you to prioritize your very own happiness, as opposed to sort of always thinking that you have to fight the bigger fight of prioritizing the community in general. And just say that the community well-being should be up to the state. It is the obligation of the state to help. Not obligation of the privileged individual. Yeah, so that's the principle as to why is it justified for you to move. Outcomes also, just very quickly, like you're obviously going to be happier, firstly. Less discrimination. So you can mitigate what Gov said here with regards to not being able to exercise your identity. You can also say that over here, sure, you may not be able to have proximate connection with your community in a foreign nation, but there are already things like structural barriers and social barriers inhibiting your ability to practice your identity anyway. And B, obviously, less discrimination in a liberal country means you have more liberty to do whatever you want, and you're happy as a result. right? So that's on like yourself, but also B, in terms of like how you're on helping out your community. You can still say that you can also help your community. For instance, this is done through things like perhaps because you're in a liberal nation. This means that the liberal country and society presumably would be more willing to listen to your stories. And that's when you can, that's when you can recount the sort of egregious discrimination that happens in your home country, shed light on these issues on a larger stage, and that's when you can utilize your influence, get more media coverage, for instance. Get more urgency, or rather you induce more urgency to counter discrimination against your community. In your home country. So you can also help out just in a different manner, right? And you can also argue that it's better off for you to help in a foreign nation because, and this is a bit of rebuttal against Gov, you may be influenced, you may be privileged, but you're still a minority. You're not able to have much influence in the government systems to enact massive changes. Changes are better attained in opposition's role when you migrate, right? So these are some of the instances where, this is where the back and forth happens. You can also just like when I always think of cases, I can always firstly talk about the principle and then the outcomes, and just it's a back and forth between the two principles and outcomes, and that's when you weigh back and forth, right? I will link this Google Doc in the WhatsApp group later if anyone is interested in having a look. If you have any questions, just feel free to also let me know. Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of our session today. Just looking at the chat for another question. The question reads, how do you counter the safe space argument that direct threats to minorities' lives are prevented on one side? How do you support the other side? So I'm assuming you're talking about the question, sorry, the answer I had to the question I had, sorry, the answer I gave to the question that was given to me just now. Okay, so I would say that any instances of like crimes and gender-based violence and like really egregious killings of people is prohibited under the criminal justice system. So you don't necessarily need you don't necessarily need a large overarching movement to protect individuals from getting killed, because that's already accorded to by the criminal justice system. So and like things like derogatory statements and slurs, all of these things, there are obviously things like defamation acts that you can utilize, for instance, and therefore you should say that the priority of these individuals, of these say trans people, for instance, a smaller minority of individuals in these instances, should not be pandering towards the rest of the minority group. It's rather establishing a sense of urgency, establishing a sense of like some that this is something that's very, very dire for trans people to have, like basic forms of protection, having toilets that are reflective of their gender, for instance, just making it very dire that these are things that the gay community is already able to achieve, for gay people, but like why is it that trans people are still left out? So just making it abundantly clear that trans people still lack a lot of these very simple forms of protection, and the point at which you're able to put this at the forefront is when there's incentive for people to want to listen to you, because they're aware of the kinds of like egregiousness that the movement has failed these minority people, and therefore that's when, like, just asserting the direness and the urgency of the situation, I think, is what I would say would be the priority for the other side in that instance. So safe space versus urgency. Yeah, I would I would envision that to be the back and forth in that regard. Yeah, any more questions? If you have any other questions, just feel free to WhatsApp me in the group just now. I think everyone is in your WhatsApp group in order to access this Zoom link. So feel free to just text me or ask in the group. We can just have a discussion there. And yeah, I hope you guys found this session to be enjoyable and informative. So next time when you're debating a social movements or a minorities motion, just bear in mind that don't homogenize, be nuanced in your characterizations, and try and resolve any sort of potential issues with like the way in which you go about forwarding movement. I think if you're able to do that, then it should be good to go for a debate on minorities. Just be empathetic, be compassionate, be considerate. And yeah, I think minorities in general will be very, very thankful to hear you guys supporting their causes. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you guys enjoyed the session, and I hope to see you guys in MNIDC Nationals in 2021 in November. Thank you very much.